everyone. So my name is Melissa Whatley. I am an assistant professor of higher education at the College of William and Mary. And this short video is to present and review the principles of QuantCrit. I'm going to share a PowerPoint slide with you. I'll also provide a PDF of this presentation that can accompany this video. That way you can reference it as you need. All right, so this is a brief overview of QuantCrit. So the first question is, what is QuantCrit? So QuantCrit is derived from critical race theory. It is in many ways, the application of critical race theory to quantitative research. And if you're familiar with critical race theory, you know that the core idea of this theory is that race is a social construct, and racism is a product of systems and policies that have biases and prejudices. So what QuantCrit does is it centers how numbers are used to protect the status quo and disguise racism. QuantCrit provides a framework to guide researcher decision making, to disrupt the status quo, and to reveal racism in the way that we go about conducting research. There are 5 principles of QuantCrit, and I'll go through each one and explain what they mean. The first one is the centrality of racism. And what this principle means is that if researchers don't take a critical perspective, quantitative analyses are likely to remake and legitimate existing racial inequities and racist hierarchies. So if we are not careful about what we are doing as quantitative researchers, what that means is that we end up reproducing the status quo. We reproduce racial hierarchies. Another way to think about this is race is not just another variable. The variables that we often use in our analyses as quantitative researchers are entrenched in deep social meaning. And as researchers, it's really our responsibility to ask critical questions about how data are collected, how data are analyzed, and how data are presented in search of bias that supports this racial status quo. The second principle of QuantCrit is that numbers are not neutral. What this means is that quantitative data are often collected, analyzed, and interpreted in ways that maintain the status quo. Another way of saying this is that quantitative approaches can and often are used to legitimize perspectives and agendas that are politically motivated. This goes back to the responsibility of the researcher to ask critical questions about the ways that the data are collected, analyzed, and interpreted. We need to pay attention to how this happens in quantitative research, particularly the research that we ourselves produce. The third principle is that categories are neither natural nor given. And for race, we can often read racism. So because of the way quantitative research works, researchers have to work with variables that put people into categories. That's the way we run our analyses. And these categories can and often are politically motivated in a way that maintains the status quo. And as a consequence, the way we categorize people often has significant negative consequences for non-white populations. So an example of this is when race is associated with negative educational outcomes for certain groups. So when we find, for example, that Black students or Latinx students perform less well in an academic setting compared to white students. The idea here is that we need to interpret a finding like that as a consequence of racism. Students who have experienced negative educational settings that do not support their progress. This is a consequence. These lower outcomes are a consequence of racism. It is not any quality that's inherent to the group itself. And often a way to go about doing this in your research is when you're writing about your results, and using the word race or names of particular race groups and interpreting your results, try substituting the word racism for where you use race, and see how that changes the way you understand your results. The fourth principle of QuantCrit is voice and insight. Data cannot speak for itself. And I think as researchers, we know this, but we often don't talk about it a lot. So just like in qualitative research, where researcher positionality is related to very deeply connected to what we end up finding in a particular study, the same is very true for quantitative research. So this means that the results of quantitative analyses are open to multiple and sometimes conflicting interpretations. Researcher perspective matters. And this is especially important for researchers who are not members of a minoritized racial or ethnic group who conduct research on that particular population. In this way, it is important to work with individuals from that population to understand how they understand your results. How do they interpret the results of statistical analyses? So it's being both honest with ourselves about our own perspectives about research, about our findings, but then also involving individuals from the population that we are studying. And then the final principle of QuantCrit is using numbers for social justice. This means that numbers can and should be used in support of social justice. Statistics is not going away anytime soon. People place a lot of value on numbers. And this means that both researchers and research consumers have to be willing to confront results that do not support the status quo. We have to be willing to ask the hard questions of our work and our data. So those are the 5 principles of QuantCrit. I hope that this video has been useful to you. This last slide contains some suggested reading if you'd like to dig a bit more deeply into this topic. The first piece, the Gilborn et al. Piece, QuantCrit, Education Policy, Big Data, and Principles for Critical Race Theory of Statistics, was the foundation for the presentation that I just gave. The second piece, the McKinley piece, that's a chapter in the Research with International Students book that focuses on critical quantitative research. And then finally, this book, The Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill, is what I think a really nice introduction to critical ideas about quantitative research for an audience that is perhaps not well versed in quantitative analysis. So if you find yourself on that feeling that you are very much a beginner in this area, that book might be a really good place for you to start.